Welcome back, everyone, to the Veterinary AI Brief. I am your co-host, Robert Sanchez, joined by the esteemed Amassecar and Dr. Adam Little. We have heard your complaints, your pleas, your cries. We are back. We promise that it won't be too long before the next episode either, and we have a whole bunch to talk to you with you about today. There has been, in the little over a month since we've recorded last, an explosion of events and repercussions specifically for the veterinary industry. We're going to keep it to three main things with you today. First off, each of us attended VMX, and we think there are really interesting takeaways and what we saw from the innovators out there. Second, just in the last week, we had the two frontier labs, OpenAI and Anthropic, drop new models that have truly incredible and near-term repercussions for the veterinary industry. And third, we have a hostile takeover by a group of lobsters now named OpenClaw. That is maybe the most fascinating AGI taste phenomena that we've gotten to date. An action-packed episode for all of you, and we are going to start it off with the handsome Amassecar talking about VMX takeaways. Aaron, over to you.
Thanks, Robert. We're just a couple of weeks after VMX. There was, as we saw with previous VMXs, a lot more AI that was on the floor. So as you walked around, there was just tons and tons of companies opening new products, new services, etc. One of the biggest things that we saw, and this actually happened right before VMX, was Instinct bought ScribbleVet, and that created quite a buzz in the space. And as a company that was not acquired, we definitely have an opinion about it. But I think just if you step back and take a look at it, Caleb Frankel, who's the CEO, primary owner of Instinct, the electronic health record system, he's done this kind of stuff before. He's a smart guy, right? So when he acquired Brief Media in the past, and he got Clinicians Brief, and he also got Plums as part of that, everyone was like, what is a software company doing buying these tools? And then very quickly, it became clear that he understood that one of the biggest values that you need to have is access to data. And so for Plums being this rich source of data that a lot of veterinarians are using every day, it made a lot of sense for him to acquire that and bring that into Instinct. And then, so for him to acquire ScribbleVet, we have to think that there's some level of intelligence that's going on there that's kind of akin to what we saw with Plums. So it created a big stir because effectively the size of the market of number of scribing tools has really dropped down. About a year ago, we thought that there might be, say, 20, down from about 50. We keep seeing new ones popping up here and there, and then they're trying to compete with some of the bigger ones. And now we're looking at it, we're like, well, there's really 3 to 5 that are leading the space. Some indications are putting Covet as the number one, but ScribbleVet and VetRec are definitely up there too. And so for ScribbleVet to be acquired by Instinct, it reshapes the space a little bit. What does that mean for the people who are ScribbleVet users? What does that mean for the people who are Instinct users? What does that mean for other companies who are left in the space? So there's a lot of questions that came out of it. All told, I think it's a good thing to show that there is long-term value in acquiring some of these companies and being able to create more value for not only the companies who are acquiring them, but the customers who are using. But it's still a lot of open questions. But yeah, that was one of the biggest things that I saw at the MX. Gents, I would love to hear from you guys. What were some of your big takeaways there?
Aaron, so before I get to my takeaway, I'm actually really curious to hear your perspective. And so for our audience that doesn't know, Aaron is a member of Covet and is one of the most forward-thinking executives on scribing. So Aaron, one thing that we're clearly seeing in the industry are PIMS companies trying to basically have scribing native to their systems. I would be really curious to hear your perspective as to how viable is that? How much wood is there to chop to build a true scribing surface for the PIMS? Maybe be curious to hear, is it just so hard? That's why Instinct tried to buy instead of build, or are there other considerations? Maybe Scribble has gathered all this data that can kind of supercharge the PIMS that they currently have. Just curious to hear how that connects to you.
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussions about, for example, PIMS, and I don't know another way to put it, but being basically the gatekeepers of innovation because they're not working on integrations with some of the scribing companies, then they're getting demonized as holding back innovation across the board. And there's so much that exists on top of and in parallel with these two systems operating that an integration is not the thing that's holding back the entire industry, right? So as much as it would be nice for all these tools to play well with each other, I don't think that's the biggest problem. So if you look at what a lot of the PIMS companies seem to be doing, it's not really hard to take a transcript of a recording and put that into a standard SOAP note. It's not really that difficult to do that. You have to have the right team. You have to understand the software. You have to understand all these things. And if that is your understanding of what scribing is, then sure, the PIMS companies can do it. At Covet, and I know some of the other leaders in the space too, there's just so much more that we're eating up around and just devouring all of the administrative work that the veterinary team needs to do. And so you start getting into things like phone calling and being able to record those phone calls inside the app. You get into medical record summarization. So being able to drop in 500 pages of medical history and have a quick summary. For specialists, that's a genius thing, right? Because then they don't have to review all those previous tests. Then there's task creation, there's billing items, there's recommendations, there's decision support, there's all of these other things that go into it. And so this, a form of myopia would look like somebody saying, well, I have a scribing tool because it creates a SOAP note. And that's just flat out not the case. And so some of the evidence that we're seeing why that's not enough for people is that we have a lot of people who are on PIMS that have some sort of scribing tool and they have Covet. And they've tried the scribing tool that exists inside the PIMS and they have Covet. So they're willing to pay more. And the really interesting thing about this is that it's an individual's choice, right? People are willing to pay the $99 per month for Covet to be able to use that on top of whatever else exists for the practice. And so they are paying out of their own pocket in order to have these tools. I think all of that speaks to the fact that, you know, we have, and I don't want to turn this into a Covet commercial, but
way too late for that, buddy. We are, like ChatGPT, the ads are in there.
But, you know, you have teams who are wholly dedicated to this new context layer that exists within the practice. Instead of it just being, yeah, we're going to turn on this functionality within the PIMS, there's teams like with, I know there's other teams that exist in the space that have like 30 to 50 people. I think we're just shy of 100 people right now on the team. And so the sales support, the dev team, all of that is creating a different kind of experience that is unlocking potential that is a lot more than just the PIMS adding on a scribing feature. So I think there's a ton more that's there. The question that's going to come up really soon is if the PIMS are able to evolve, then at what rate are they going to be able to catch up with some of the companies who are wholly dedicated to this? And I think it's going to be a whole lot slower than a lot of people would like. You know, people talk about feature parity, and that you just look across the spectrum of the leaders in the scribing space, and they are truly copilots that are developing a context layer. And it's way more than just the PIMS or some other company turning on this functionality.
So, Aaron, I think what you said makes total sense. And kind of the way I'm thinking about it is the traditional kind of critique of the PIMS being a mile wide and an inch deep. Right. So like they'll try to add on all these features that are really important, but you really need like a depth of expertise to do one particular job really well. And I think in that light, kind of the takeaway to me for our audience is one, I mean, if you're not using a scribe, you should. Covet's awesome with Aaron. There's a burgeoning ecosystem now, as he said. And two, I actually think if that's the case, if PIMS companies, if their kind of eyes are larger than their stomach as far as what they can take on, this acquisition could really make a lot of sense. Because if it's an important function for the practice, and I mean, most PIMS companies have these very thin, applications there that really don't do justice to what the frontier companies are currently doing. Like an acquisition play might really make sense there. My takeaway from VMX, and I was there for Startup Circle for the launch of Spotlight. So I didn't really get to walk the halls and talk to as many people, I think, as you two did. But I had like a wonderful experience at a fear-free dinner. Thank you, Marty Becker, for always including me, sitting next to some really forward-thinking people. And what I got is this deep, it was almost like a finger on the pulse from the executives in the industry, that it's this feeling of, hey, I know AI is coming and I really want to get ahead of it. I'm just not totally sure how, right? Because when we look at AI, especially the new model releases that we're going to be talking about, it completely changes our priors as to what's a defensible business mode now. And so I think there are a lot of people who are kind of grappling with this idea that I don't know if my business is as sound as it was before, because somebody who really understands how to build through agentic engineering can spin something up very quickly that took me years to build. And so I think we're in this period of wrestling, and that's why this podcast exists, right? We see that there are these new awesome capabilities, but we're not totally sure how it connects to our industry yet. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but part of the fallout that we can see is software stocks have been getting hammered recently. Salesforce is down, I don't know what, like 25% in the last few months. The other big SaaS companies altogether lost like $1 trillion in 1 week in February. I think there's a sense of almost like there's some people who are afraid and some people who are like, oh my God, I can build anything I want right now. And so it's just going to be really interesting to see that tension play out and see how our industry evolves. Adam, what did you see?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a kind of a few things that stood out. One is I do think this maturing conversation around AI, Aaron highlighted the instinct acquisition. I do think there are veterinary specific challenges, but then there's just kind of the broader ones that you were speaking about, Robert, where it's like every large company is going through this in every industry. And in many ways, and we can debate this, but I think the veterinary industry in many ways is more resilient than others, especially when it comes to sort of the speed of adoption that we're seeing. But I do think you are also seeing, to what Aaron's pointed out, is this kind of different vision of what the future looks like. And so will these capabilities be incremental or completely sort of transformative in a way that you have to rethink all aspects of your business? Most of the time, for me, it's not so much what you're building, but like the how and the muscle behind it. So as an example, something that propels a company like Covet and other startup to go faster is that every single function in that business is using these AI tools, support, legal, finance. And so even if you were trying to build to the same end state, the team and the alignment and the tool set that they have available is quite a bit different. So that's certainly something that stood out to me. The second is, I think, this kind of growing divide between people that are taking advantage of these capabilities and really kind of retraining themselves almost like every, couple of months, it sounds like, versus those that are still just dealing with them or getting their feet wet for the first time. I think that there's a lot of conversations that I have at VMX where somebody would say, yeah, AI is not going to do that, or that skill set is protected. And it's kind of like, well, this is already happening, right? This is like today. And so I think that should give everybody pause, because if your mindset is, this is like a fundamental blocker, something that AI is never going to like change this task, I think we're going to be surprised for a very long time about the ways that AI begins to infiltrate our lives. So I think that's also really interesting.
And Adam, sorry, if I could pause right there, because I think that's such an interesting point. Could you maybe give the audience a couple examples of what you're seeing that maybe priors are like,
So especially talking about VMX specifically. So this was a year where there was a lot of AI receptionists, right? That seems like a burgeoning kind of use case or category for AI. And I know there's a lot of folks who are still saying like, I'd never talk to an AI, or my clinic is so complex that an AI would never be able to properly handle and act as a receptionist. And then you sort of lay out the case a little bit where it's like, okay, how many of your conversations today are actually high quality conversations at the top of the credential or using your best available team member And it turns out it's a small percentage of them. Like a lot of phone calls never get answered, or people are on hold, or they don't have the information to properly handle that context. And so this kind of ideal state of a conversation is not the lived experience for everybody that calls your clinic. The second part is that these AI platforms are now being able to not only just incorporate your individual practice context, but learn very quickly about the specific preferences and roles. And so I think very quickly you're getting to a point where you'd almost prefer to talk to AI because it's immediate. It understands who you're calling and can take that next action. But I think the other thing, this kind of gets a little bit, we'll talk about like OpenClaw in a second, is that there'll be enforcing functions that I think veterinary practices can't fully appreciate. So as an example, even if you're a clinic that wholeheartedly loves human to human conversations, what happens when the conversations that your clients place are their AI agents? And suddenly your people that need to be responsible for the front desk are spending their time talking to AI. And you're going to get to the point where the AI impacts and the flywheels are going to compound, where as a response to increased AI from the clients, your response is probably going to be AI from the practice level, a little bit akin to what happened with telemedicine, and everybody had to like go virtual, not because we all wanted to embrace telemedicine necessarily, but because nobody was allowed to interact with each other. And so I think those forcing functions, those market forces become really interesting kind of moments in adoption. I think the last thing is a little bit of this level of autonomy and agency. So I sat in on a really interesting review of PetSmart Charity's latest report on the state of veterinary cost of care. That was another kind of trend that came up a lot in conversations. And I think where that responsibility lies in order to address that is something that I think is the industry is really grappling with. So imagine for a second, you're an associate in a practice. Your costs have increased, 30 to 40% over the last 18 months. You have new ownership, you have a new team, you have a new software system, and pet owners are complaining about the cost of care. You're being told that we need to do more to drive visits. And you're sort of sitting here being like, I didn't make any of these decisions, right? Like, why is it my responsibility to now take on that extra task? It's not to say I want to make care inaccessible by any means, but my sense of agency or my level of responsibility might differ what you would like it. So I think that's really challenging in a world in which there's clearly an emphasis to practice in many ways at a higher level of care, to introduce more technology, to introduce more products and services. This kind of underlying tension that I think is now really becoming more apparent, that a lot of members are just not coming in or can't afford to participate in the veterinary care models of today. And how do you reconcile that with sometimes veterinarians kind of being caught in the middle of it? So I had some interesting conversations there. And I think our hope is collectively that technology will be deflationary with respect to veterinary care, but that hasn't necessarily materialized yet. And so we talked about this on the show before. Will scribe efficiency gains allow more visits that over time decreases the cost of care? I don't think it's as simple as an equation of that. And I think we're already kind of seeing some of this with this technology where people are using that freed up administrative time in other ways, as opposed to like making care more affordable. And so I think that will continue to be a part of the conversation, which is, hey, AI is awesome. I think it's awesome. There's a lot of really cool things that are happening, but how is it changing the fundamentals of what we're seeing in the market? And I think that is a more gray, less clear path forward right now. So those are just a couple observations.
Just one quick tag up on what you said, Adam, because I think it's fascinating. The idea of whether or not AI will be deflationary as being the wrong vantage point, I completely agree with you. I think one thing AI does is it disproportionately rewards kind of first principles thinking, getting as close to what the real problem is that you're trying to solve, because everything else can kind of be built. And so like one really interesting question for everyone to be grappling with is the current way that we look for signal for disease the most efficient way to do it? And I would argue almost certainly no. Like having a pet come in once every 6 months or every year, looking for disease signals through that can't be the way that we should be doing things. I can think of a few different ways that would be just so expansive in how we can truly care for, orders of magnitudes more animals. And that to me is like the really exciting promise of AI. Go ahead, Adam.
I think AI has the potential to make care radically more efficient and affordable if you can birth a model of care that can take advantage of it. So as an example, if the introduction of an AI receptionist and triage and decision support allows you to do telemedicine at scale, or allows you to build a practice that maybe physically looks different because you can really focus on a certain segment of the population or a certain type of care. That's interesting. And I think the care models that AI can then power look different. But you can see the rub here, where if we're taking these technologies and fundamentally shoehorning them in to an existing care model, as opposed to rethinking everything, it's a little bit like the analog to the PIMS that we're talking about. Well, AI can just be a bolt-on. And you're like, yeah, well, maybe the bolt-on problem is the same for bolting it onto an existing model of care, because you're not re-architecting the clinic around AI from the ground up. And what we see is that when that happens, there's a lot of regulatory headwinds. It turns out that there's a lot of reasons that people do not fundamentally change the model of care. And so I think the level of discomfort maybe that we're talking about that providers have just gets amplified when you look at the level of discomfort people are going to have about this overall model of care, because you can imagine a world in which we love this general direction, but when packaged in a way that changes the role of the veterinarian, either having them become more of like an orchestrator of care and maybe seeing more patients across a team-wide spot, people don't like that. And so I do think that will be an undergoing tension. And on the human health side, we're seeing this past week, there was a company that like ground up AI native human healthcare for free. That's going to be their shtick. I mean, I'm curious to see what new models this will birth, and whether when pushed, how supportive veterinary medicine actually is around those models, because I think it's not going to be a black and white thing.
Adam, that is fascinating. And I think this is going to be a discussion that we're going to have and continue for quite some time. So the second topic that we have for all of you today is something that I have been dying to talk to you and with you about for some time now. And, I kept trying to do it. Adam and Aaron kept saying, Robert, no, they're not ready. They're not ready to see the Matrix. And I fought for you. I want you to know that. So basically, something happened in late November that completely changed the world. And it's why all these stocks are getting totally hammered and wiped out right now. And I'd love to talk about it. So there are a few what we call frontier labs. These are the labs that are putting out the best models, the ones that are typically trusted by like enterprise customers. So there's OpenAI, which is ChatGPT. We all know them. There's Google with Gemini, and they have kind of fallen behind here. And the third and final one is, at least as far as business usage, third and final one is Anthropic. Now, Anthropic is actually a spinoff from OpenAI. Like they were executives who worked at OpenAI. They thought OpenAI wasn't taking safety seriously enough. And they decided to really work on something called the alignment problem, which is something for another day. But what Anthropic focuses is on software engineering. That's really what they care about. They don't have an image model. They don't have any of the other stuff that the labs are focused on doing. They want to figure out how to automate software engineering. And so they have two main models. There's Sonnet and there's Opus. Opus is kind of like the high-powered model that we use. If you know, like ChatGPT Pro, that would be the equivalent. And there was an update to the Opus model to 4.5 in late November. In typical Anthropic fashion, there wasn't a whole lot of hullabaloo in the media around how great this model was from them, like OpenAI will kind of do. They just fucking ship, that's all they do. Over the holiday break, what seems to have happened is all these engineers and entrepreneurs and executives really started trying Opus 4.5 in something called Claude Code, which is kind of like a harness for how to interact with the model. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. And it completely blew and changed their minds as to what was now possible. So what seems to have figured out is how to have long-running agentic software tasks that you could trust to be faithfully built. Another way of saying that is you could very clearly state what you wanted the software to be and how you wanted to act, and you would actually get like good quality code that would functionally work in the messiness of the real world. And so what we've seen is this shift. Last year, we had something called vibe coding, where we talked about this, right? It was this really cool ability to basically spin up prototypes. So you could build something with like a Lovable or a Replit, or hell, even like a Claude Code, and it could look pretty impressive. Now, under the hood, there wasn't the kind of architectural rigor that you would find in enterprise applications, but you could really build something that looked pretty darn cool. That is what has changed. So vibe coding has birthed a new skill that is commonly referred to now as agentic engineering. And I think it's the most valuable and important skill on earth right now, because what you can now do with Claude Code and Opus 4.5 is build any idea that requires bytes, right? So like you basically have a magic wand. You can spin up anything. Let me give you an example. So some of the conversations I was having at VMX was about like this like personal assistant that I've built that I think could have incredible ramifications for veterinary medicine and is doing some pretty crazy things for digital empathy as far as like ramping our own capabilities and how we serve our clients. Basically, what my personal assistant does is it is plugged into all my context, granola transcripts, every meeting. After a meeting, it's going to sum up all the action items that I have and do a first pass at them, and they're pretty darn good. My emails, I get a triage in the morning of all the different emails that I need to respond to, and it'll give me a first pass at those. It's like having a real personal assistant who has all of my context and is really smart. Salesforce, I never have to worry about data entry again. Like this can faithfully do that. And so I would pay like $1 million for this system, and I did this over the break. And so what we're seeing are these two model releases where now actually Anthropic released a new one called Opus 4.6 and OpenAI released something called Codex 5.3. It's not super important to know the model numbers. The idea is like Opus and Codex have these incredible new capabilities now. And the thing that is so important for this industry to grapple with is the floodgates are open. Anybody can build any software now. If they have the curiosity and commitment to really learn how to build with AI, abandon your priors as to whether or not just like a single technician or veterinarian could actually build a multi-million-dollar company. I promise you, they can disrupt the old incumbents. They can build something totally new. We're about to see an explosion of creativity because there is now no barrier between idea and execution. Like there used to be this bottleneck. You would have to go to the high priests who are the engineers who would say, okay, I can build this for you in this time. You can just do it now. It's absolutely incredible. And it's so hard for you to understand until you actually get into these models. Team, I would love to know, like, what are your thoughts? What have you been seeing? How does it make you think about what the present and future holds here?
So I can jump in and talk a little bit about my experience with it. I think it's really important to emphasize the learning curve at the beginning of the process, right? Because you don't just open up a browser and say, hey, create a software that's going to replace X, Y, and Z in my practice, right? I've been struggling through a little bit of it, trying to figure out how to actually use Claude Code, for example. And it's not super easy. So does that mean that, even by the time that this airs, that's going to be the case? Not really, right? Because I think what we're seeing, and the point that you're making, is that the barriers and the friction points that slow somebody down from being able to create something like this are very quickly disappearing. And so as a result of that, we're having more and more people. The other thing to keep in mind is you can't just build software and just watch your bank account increase, right? It's not quite that straightforward because any company still has to have a sales team. They still have to have a support team. They still have to, and all of those things are getting better. The friction points associated with every single one of those is being reduced. However, you still have to sell things to people, right? And sometimes it's the agent selling to another agent, and and we've got some examples of that, which is kind of interesting. But nevertheless, it's not like somebody could start tomorrow and displace all of their software by the weekend. Like that's not the world that we live in yet. Will we see this like evolution that happens over time? For sure, but it's not quite that quick. So I don't want to be like a techno pessimist here, but I think that there is like a certain like tempering of expectations that we have to have, and it's our responsibility to have those expectations slowed down just a little bit for the entire profession.
Aaron, we're going to hop on a Zoom. Give me an hour. I'm going to teach you Claude Code. It's going to blow your fucking mind. Yeah, you can't get in there and just say, build me $1 million SaaS. Sure. But if you can get really deep on what a problem is, like if you're a practitioner and you have a privileged vantage point as to a certain problem in your practice, and you spend a weekend just digging in, fucking around with Claude Code, I so respectfully disagree. I think you can build much quicker than maybe we've seen before. But hey,
Okay. So I'm not going to disagree with that. I'm not going to disagree that you could, but in order to have $1 million in your bank account, you have to sell that to somebody else. Right. And so solving your own problems, totally agree. You can use these tools in ways that we haven't really seen before. And there are going to be innovators within the space who are looking at us and being like, well, I did that last weekend. Like, what are these guys talking about? Right. Like, this is nothing new. Because some of the smartest people I've ever met are veterinarians. And the way in which they tackle problems, if they're able to generalize their thinking to problem sets more broadly and then tackle those, super effective, super successful. However, I don't think that people get into vet in order to make money. I think they get into it because of the care of the animal and the care of the people through their animals. So I don't know if we're going to see this like explosion of software that I think a lot of us want to see to increase the efficiency of the practices. But I do think that there's going to be a surge of new things that are going to be coming over the next 6 to 12 months where somebody solves a problem and then shares it with somebody else. And then that kind of benevolence and generosity is going to spread. I think we'll see more of that for sure. And this new model where it'll be like a marketplace of here's my distilled intelligence, just use it and share it. You know, we're already starting to see it, but I think we're just going to see more of it. Anyways, I'll stop pumping the brakes. Those are my thoughts.
Adam, Aaron thinks that it has a more conservative time horizon. I think this is basically apocalypse. Where do you sit in the middle of this?
Probably in the middle, maybe a couple points about why I'm really excited about it. I think this previous generation of veterinarians, the phrase that was used a lot was, you go to vet school because you want to learn to care for animals, but not because you know how to run a business. And that was sort of used as this kind of punching down by a lot of industry folks to basically tell veterinarians you can't or shouldn't own and manage a practice. And I think you saw that, right? People's willingness to take on that risk and own practices. We sort of entered this model where that became less and less feasible. And I think now those are the exact tasks that AI is going to be really helpful with. It turns out that knowledge work that, yes, veterinarians might not have had a lot of experience or exposure to, are the exact things that AI is really good at doing. It can generate a market plan. It can help you with human resources. It can analyze whether or not it's a good fit to open a practice there. And so the domain expertise actually becomes increasingly important in this new era. And if you can properly articulate your problem, you're in a really good position to be able to use some of these capabilities to actually build the solution. So I think the short-term or micro consequence of this is that veterinarians will now be able to start to use these tools to not just help, but actually solve their problems and create their own interfaces. And as a result, they'll have more appreciation for some of the trade-offs around building software, because that's always been a bit of a barrier, because now they're going to have to be forced to make some of those choices. But on a macro side, I think that there's a real possibility that you'll see practice owners emerge that are like, I have a team of agents to give me the confidence and expertise I need to take a bigger swing, like opening a practice or expanding my team or doing a renovation or choosing the right option. And I think the bigger opportunity isn't necessarily the shift that happens at the practice level, but if I'm a practice group, the thing that I'm most like scratching my head about is like this big layer of middle management that I sold everybody on needing is going to have to look considerably different. Now, those folks can actually be more effective. But if you're somebody today that's just moving information in and out of programs and computer screens, your job is likely to change very, very quickly. And so I do think that's an interesting kind of evolution of the model. I think the other thing too is that there's a big difference between I want to like vibe code my PIMS versus I want to create a specific application for a specific task on top of it. I think what's going to happen is this sort of bifurcation where there's going to be, in some cases, a lot of resilience and durability with certain systems of record because they're really critical. They have a different sales cycle. They have different expectations. There's regulatory pieces of them versus what is going to be a complete fracturing of kind of the UI layer. And I think scribes are just probably the first example of that. And so I think that's going to be really fascinating when people just start saying, okay, for this specific task, it turns out, you know, when I'm driving to work every day, I want a podcast of my upcoming patients. And then from there, I'm going to start to just have a voice assistant that I can talk to and summarize my cases. And maybe that's all driven by the individual. And then the last point I'll make is that a lot of this is still happening, to Aaron's point, in very small pockets with individuals. And so there isn't this kind of broader learning that's getting applied across the organization. And I think that's both a real opportunity and a real threat to some of these groups, where the most talented people in your organization right now have this mindset, probably because of your posture as an organization, that they're using AI to, like, quote unquote, right? It's like, as opposed to showing you how we're doing this in some of these use cases, I'm going to do this so I look really good at my individual job. And I do think that gray use is likely to become amplified as these tools can now connect to other platforms and user logins, are just become way more visible with their kind of footprints across more and more tools. So those are maybe a couple things. Yeah, this ability to draw that personalized tools, how that might reshape or flip the historical constraints or top-down attitudes towards this next generation of practice owners, and some of this balance of kind of the gray individual use versus this kind of team-wide adoption as these platforms accelerate.
So I think you both made really interesting points there. I just kind of want to tie them together and then move on to our next topic, which is maybe the most fascinating one. And it's the attack of the lobster. So, Aaron, I think you brought up a good point that there is a learning curve here, that you can't just, Claude Code, you have to use something called the terminal, which is the command line interface. It's the scary black box that really only programmers use. They're weird signals. A lot of people are scared of it. I was too. And so it's not as though you can just open up the terminal and say, solve this problem. You should spend a weekend kind of digging into best practices and really understanding how you do agentic engineering. But I've never written a line of code in my life. And now I've written 3 different functional systems that have 250,000 lines of code each that actually work and do really interesting things for digital empathy. And I think, Adam, to your point, the really interesting opportunity isn't necessarily going to be for a veterinary practitioner to say, hey, I'm sick and tired of paying my PIMS dues, so I'm just going to recreate it. It's like, oh, magic wand. No, it's the privileged, unique vantage point that you have, with specifically your own problems. I think kind of broader market, some of these margins will get eaten away because new small startups can that are focused can build some of these applications now. But for maybe more our listeners, the really interesting thing I love the idea that you said, hey, if you get access to your PIMS to be able to integrate with it, you could turn with 11 Labs, which is this voice synthesis. You could say, hey, every night, download a report that has all of my next day's visits, go scrape those medical records and those previous tests, everything like that, turn it into a 20-minute podcast that I can listen to on my drive to work. And now I don't have to prep for rounds the same way before. And maybe I can do that with my discharges too.
People are, this is the other thing, veterinarians are already doing this. This is the other thing that I think is really important to note, that via tools like Notebook LLM,
yeah,
I know of veterinarians who have built their own decision support tools that are building their own systems, right? These are freely available off-the-shelf tools. And so it's really just, sorry to interrupt, Robert, but sometimes I think, people think that folks are going to be waiting for permission or a veterinary specific solution. And I think what all these horizontal capabilities are showing us is that you're giving this incredibly powerful tool, and people are going to use it in whatever way that they want and need. And it's probably a good segue to OpenClaw, because there's some trade-offs once you have that, but this isn't slowing down. And I guess the takeaway being that now that you've reached a point where Anthropic said 100% of their engineers code is written by Cloud Code. OpenAI just released something that said no human will write code. They'll be reviewing and orchestrating and doing those rules, but engineering is changing. And I think it is a bit of a canary in the coal mine for any of this knowledge work. And obviously there's some really compounding benefits of engineering being the first one that's transformed, because it turns out coding is a really integral part for all these places, right? If you're doing legal work or something like that, you can see now these tools in the back and literally writing code and creating programs to be able to help you with your certain task. And so the arbitrage of just being close to these newest advances is just so great, because there's so many people who are still stuck in, my experience to AI is a bad ChatGPT response, or my Siri still doesn't know the weather, or what have you. That's a significant number of people versus people in the use cases that you're talking about. So I think we're at a point where the people at the kind of the front edge here are just in a Ferrari speeding away, and the rest of the world is trying to figure out, okay, how do I start to use these tools? And I think that, Aaron, that's a little bit reflected in the tension that you were saying, which is that if you are not yet using them and the learning curve now seems increasingly steep, it could create a real divide between sort of these AI first native workers and those that were intimidated 3 months ago.
Adam, or I think you just said that Aaron is driving a Ford Pinto. That's what I heard.
When it comes to Claude Code, I'm barely on my bicycle, let alone a Pinto.
Say like, I think this was the month that for me, I was like, this is moving real fast. Like I can't possibly keep up. And now I'm seeing things that are, wow, I'm falling behind. And it wasn't like a year ago or 6 months ago even. And so it just comes back to that need to really immerse yourself and then find ways in order to expose yourself to these tools, which can be challenging when it seems really jarring, and B, we'll talk about this, but like the safety and security risks that are emerging are very real and detractors from people. As you know, you have some pirates go off and then some folks that are a little bit closer to the ship. So I hear you on that tension because I'm experiencing it too.
There was a really interesting post on Twitter by a gentleman named Kevin Roos, who does a podcast called, oh my God, I forget the name of it. That's crazy. He said basically he's never seen this divide. And Adam, this is kind of to your point, where you have people who are running 24/7 lobsters to do like asymmetric work that is making real dollars in their bank account, and they're shipping. They're operating at a fundamentally different level than what we've seen an individual operate before. And then you've got another class of society who's just kind of still trying to figure out, is AI vaguely threatening? Like, what do I do? Maybe I type into ChatGPT once in a while, but it's not harnessing this incredible output. And Adam, I think this would be a super interesting time to talk about maybe the weirdest and craziest phenomena that we've seen to date, which is the rise of the lobster.
Yeah. So when Robert's talking about lobster, he's basically referring to OpenClaw, which is formerly Claude. So taking a step back, I guess it was a couple of weeks ago now, like late January, this individual by the name of Peter Steinberger basically created this autonomous agent, personalized assistant based on Claude Code. And originally it was called Claude Bot, then it went to Moltbot, which spawned Moltbook. I'll talk about it in a second. Now it's known as OpenClaw. And what makes it really unique relative to some of these other AI applications and sort of interfaces is that it uses primarily like Messenger, Telegram, WhatsApp, etc., but it has deep access to your tools and your file system, so it can do a lot more things on your behalf. And one of the things that these individuals who were kind of spawning these autonomous agents up to was creating like a social network. So over the course of a few days, Moltbook, which was really like a Reddit style forum posting, grew to 1.5 million agents posting back and forth. And so on one end, you have people saying, well, this is just a whole bunch of slop, and people are telling their AI agents, go hang out in this like a weird internet cafe and post about existential threats to humanity. But I think the other part is this kind of emergent sort of behavior where you're seeing these AI systems interact. But since then, a couple of things have been interesting. Because of the access to systems that have created, there's been a bunch of like security threats and exposure that now new companies are getting created in order to protect and make it easier for people to create these systems. Mac Minis sold out a bunch of places because people were buying dedicated computers to run these agents. People are getting their own email address and their own social accounts. And so even this concept of an assistant, do I want it to be kind of pretending to be me, or should it have its own identity? This past Friday, there was this guy by the name of Nate Ellison, his agent Felix, who, by the way, is amazing to watch and just works constantly. They did a webinar that was hosted by a company called Every. They had 1,200 people show up, and they were kind of going through their setup. But his agent has actually created its own guide and started selling that guide and generating real revenue over the course of a couple of weeks. And so I say all that because it's kind of like the Wild West, but what you're seeing is this set of emerging behaviors and use cases, a bunch of prickly ways that this is coming out, and then new companies or new approaches that are being almost created and spun up in near real time to then solve them. So to your point about the on-ramp, using the terminal was really difficult. And so there's companies now that have made it like a lot easier and more secure to be able to create your own OpenClaw kind of autonomous account. But the thing I think for me that's really interesting is at the end of the day, it's showing the value in these personalized assistants that have deep context and deep access to your tools. And the individual, this guy, Peter, who created this, basically said, like, this thing is going to replace like 80% of the apps on your phone, because it turns out, why am I going to these dedicated apps? Why am I doing these dedicated button clicks if the app or my assistant's just serving up to me the exact information in the exact format at the exact time that I need, and then being able to go away and take action? And so it sort of seems in some ways like it was like the promised version of Siri, but now it's, the mascot's a lobster. And I think it's just really interesting to see how jagged and weird the future is. So to give you a specific example, one of these kind of supporting services that was created on the back of OpenClaw was Rent a Human. And what Rent a Human allows the agents to do is to literally hire a human in the real world to perform a task that the AI can't do. And people kind of shake their heads and look at this, look at Aaron, and I'd ask Aaron, like, what do you think DoorDash is? Right? Like, so it's weird. And you kind of get back to like the packaging of these things, but we've had lots of examples where, technology is basically hired humans to do these things. And I just think it's been really interesting to see a project like this gain so much momentum so quickly, but also maybe provide some hints as to where we're going with that AGI future on the horizon. I'll stop there. If nothing else, it's an interesting social experiment. What did you guys think?
So we can cut this out, but this is by far my favorite.
Cutting this out? That's it. It's phenomenal.
Yeah. So that was from Andre Karpathy, and he was just making this comment. And it's been really interesting to follow a lot of his texts over time, where he, in December of this past year, he said, I've never felt so behind as a programmer, and if like somebody like that is saying, I've never felt so far behind, also not like this, the Matrix reference where she's about to be killed. And then anyways, crazy.
It's crazy when someone like him is saying how quickly things have changed and how we've kind of crossed the point, especially for coding, that you don't go back. He wrote a post a little bit of like the loss of that as well, which I think is really interesting. But again, speaking about the risk, here's a smart guy who was experimenting with this that might have had their API keys exposed because of, so I mean, it kind of feels like the early days of like payments on the internet in some respects, right? And now there's billions, hundreds of billions of dollars that are transacted each year online. And so we've been comfortable doing things that seem scary at scale on the internet. And this just seems like a different service area vector, but we're going to have the supporting tissue on it to make it safe and scalable over time, I think. But Robert, what do you think?
First off, Aaron, I just man, a million points for bringing up Andrej Karpathy. For the audience that doesn't know,
Friend of the pod, right?
Yeah, right. Friend of the pod, co-founder of OpenAI. He headed up. He's a co-founder of OpenAI, right? I'm not imagining that. I know he led Tesla's self-driving. I'm pretty sure he's a co-founder of OpenAI too. Anyways, he is a giant in AI and software engineering, and he has been speaking to this issue on Twitter about just how fast this is moving. And really interesting thing is I think for a lot of software engineers, they're going to get beaten. Software engineering is not about code. It's about value, right? It's about solving problems. And you can be somebody who's never written a line of code, and I promise you, outpunch a 30-year full stack software engineer if you truly get how to use Codex and Claude Code. And he's kind of speaking to that on Twitter, and he's somebody to really trust. I think that the really interesting thing to me about ClaudeBot is, first off, Eve is better, my own personal assistant, in almost every way, except for one way. And by the way, disclaimer, we do not recommend you setting up ClaudeBot just willy-nilly right now, because there are you could very easily lose a lot of money, security risks out the wazoo. There are ways to safely do it, but don't just run in guns blazing.
Just do it. Just make sure you buy Mac Mini first.
I love that. It's like the
well, hands down, we tried it, people, because I mean, there's got to be someone out there who's tried it. I'm very tempted.
Seriously, do want to know? Please do let us know. So to me, the really interesting thing is this. There was an article I read called "Infinite Minds That Never Sleep." And it's this idea that, okay, so when I'm using Eve, my personal assistant, she goes offline when I shut off the terminal, right? So when I stop interacting with her, she doesn't do any more work. That's not what ClaudeBot does or OpenClaw does. This is a 24/7, working on your behalf agent. It's going and doing interesting things in the real world. It's this idea of asymmetric output and leverage. that you can have one, or hell, if you can have one, why not have 10 or a million different agents going off and doing valuable things for you in the real world? Let me give you an example. So for me, it might be really interesting to know every possible thing that has been written about, a prospect in veterinary medicine, like somebody who I think should be a customer for digital empathy, distilled into like maybe a 2-paragraph brief, or maybe like about a competitor, or maybe about, somebody who I'm about to have a meeting with, or maybe there's some interesting research that I just want done as I sleep that's going to take a long time to compile. But, some agent can go off and do that. And maybe there are a million other things like that, not just research, but other valuable things. Anything a human could do with a computer, you can now have an agent doing for you as you sleep. You can have multiple agents doing for you as you sleep. I'm having a hard time just imagining all the ways that you can utilize this, but I know this has part of the excitement in kind of the Silicon Valley community is we're sniffing that this has real repercussions. This idea that unchaining an agent to your terminal, something that can go off on your behalf and do valuable work for you while you sleep, while you're doing other things, this is going to have profound implications for society. That's what it's got me thinking. Like, it's a crazy headspace to be in. What do you guys think?
Your point about the creativity is really one that I see a lot. I just think people are thinking this way too narrowly, right? So I'll give you an example. Let's say in your veterinary practice management software today, you have like 5,000 clients, right? Well, that data today is fairly static. It only gets updated by the humans for the most part. Maybe you have a couple applications that link some of that stuff together. And so you might be thinking, well, wouldn't it be great if the AI could just make that data better and more accurate? So maybe the addresses are wrong, or we don't know if emails or phone numbers are up to date. So that's pretty interesting. But really quickly, you're like, well, that's nothing. Like, what if we got and read all the attachments that were part of that medical record to set them up on the right campaigns? And what if we went through all the publicly available information on those clients to enrich their profiles so that we knew not only their information about where they are, but their attitudes towards their pet's health or other things that are important to them? What if we went and did research on all the other products that they mentioned and from those conversations or from the scribes? And then what if on the back of that information, we developed all the personalized communication? So when we texted them or sent them in a campaign or sent them an email, it was like we were talking to those individuals. And then what if we generated a script for the veterinarian before they went into that exam so that they were prepared with the right set of questions moving forward? And you're like, oh, I just thought it would make the data accurate, right? It's like, no, these workflows are so quickly going to surpass what the humans in my practice are doing to work that humans never could have done in the first place. And I think Aaron and I were having this conversation offline, but I think we're really looking at this space from a very zero-sum perspective. So what I mean by that is, there's about 20, 30, maybe highest 40% of veterinary time today that's administrative time. And as tools like Scribes and others start to change that, in theory, that time gets freed up. And some of that time is going to go to clinical work, right? Hopefully we see more appointments. Hopefully we have greater efficiency. But there's some structural reasons why it isn't like, save a minute here, gain a minute of clinical work, right? What I think it's far more interesting is what are the new knowledge tests that get unlocked as a result of veterinarians that now have 20 to 30% of their day armed with AI. And that, I think, is going to unleash a level of creativity that we never thought possible. And just to kind of show you one small application, there was some work done by Brian Herr. He's a veterinarian research scientist. My understanding, he helped with VIN's AI thing. He recently published this paper or this update where they were looking at medical records to be able to see, basically refute a paper about a standard of care that when they went back into the research, this is around decades old drug risks for antibiotic use for dry eye. I will show a link to the paper, but basically the medical research was based on a very small study. They went back and looked at millions of records and found that, hey, this drug should be less contraindicated in the veterinary community. And so that's just one specific example, right? We're going to do that for everything. And so I think that it's really interesting when we talk about these transformative capabilities from such a narrow low ceiling set of transformation in our space, as opposed to everything is going to have to go through this reimagining. And I think that creativity and domain expertise are actually limiting factors in this. So anyway, I'll pause there. That's my rant for this episode. But I just say we have to think about the work that AI can help us accomplish that we never thought possible before. And that's way more interesting to me to discuss than how does it change this task in an incremental way.
Just for the record, that is your 4th rant for this episode, just so we're clear. It's interesting, right? Because all of it starts with a really simple question. What am I trying to accomplish? What is the thing that I'm trying to achieve? And then being able to stand back and say, okay, but why am I doing that? Like, what is the purpose of that? And it's that level of abstraction that is not a natural disposition for most people. But the more that you can do that and say, okay, this particular thing here, what am I trying to achieve with this? What are the workflows that enable that? Is there some tool that I can build in order to then enable those workflows to operate semi-autonomously, still with my supervision and making sure that that's working? But it's that question that keeps bridging out to further and further applications of the software that you're going to be able to use and deploy in your practice in order to solve bigger and bigger problems more quickly. And it's just that really simple question, like, what am I trying to accomplish? What am I trying to do here? How is that related to the next step and the next step and the next step? And then can I ask for 5 steps down the line rather than having to supervise every single step along the way? Once that gets elevated and you understand that that's what you're actually doing, I think a lot of different possibilities suddenly get unlocked.
Aaron, I think what I'm hearing from you is that it is the philosopher our time to shine here, because we try to get as close to the metal as possible, right? It's getting as close to the core of understanding what's the actual problem. Like, what's the real thing in the world that I'm trying to change? And Adam, man, I love what you said. I think this idea of one of my favorite books is 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. And he kind of talks about how there's this almost lurking pessimism in Western culture and has been basically since the Kennedy administration. And it's because of this kind of zero-sum mindset that we have. But the incredible thing that I think, you're talking about is that AI, and specifically what we've seen in the last couple of months, is causing us to have to fundamentally rethink our priors and lose many of them. And the future can be so expansive, and it belongs to the people who have this deep domain expertise and this level of creativity. I think that's going to be one of the things, like exploring these ideas, bringing on people who are operating this way, that it gets me really excited for the future of this show, just like continuing to do that, because man, I don't think this is about carving up a market in a different way. I think this is about reimagining what veterinary care can do and mean for, the people and pets on this earth. So I'd love to sign off with a, new thing we're going to be doing, which is having you, the audience, consider a question to be pondering until next week. And Adam, I think you have been thinking about something. You want to take us away here?
Yeah, sure. So I think the simplest one is like, what's something that you could try in the next week that doesn't require the permission of anybody else? Doesn't require you having to pay a bunch of money or get a bunch of tools integrated, but just one way to start to use these tools and solve a problem that you actually care about. And it doesn't have to be for anybody else but yourself. But I do think, to Aaron's point earlier, we need to continue to push people who are listening to this ourselves to constantly try new things, because I think the biggest risk that the profession has right now is not tangibly doing that. So what I would say is, if you're somebody who has built something or using AI in a new way, let us know. We'd love to highlight and profile it. You're trying to code an app or you're having some challenges or what have you. I think that we need to work on finding and amplifying those stories. So if you're somebody who over the next week, as a result of this, tries to something, definitely let us know. And I just want to give a shout out to my wife, who this week started doing exactly that. She wanted to build a communication coach for herself or for practices using transcript data. She literally went on, found a lovable course, followed it, and started building her own concepts. So Dr. Little, the real Dr. Little, shout out to you, because it was really cool to see that come to life. And you could see how much of her passion and creativity and her focus on the problem manifested in what she built, primarily as a solution for herself initially. So that was really cool.
Hell yeah, Adam. All right, this is Aaron, Adam, and Robert signing off. We'll see you again soon, and we can't wait to see the kind of future you're going to help build. Thanks, everyone.